A subvention or logos, nomos from the god can always keep um, something like a river flowing. It's said, according to the Eastern wisdom, that one can't push the river. That one should. The implication is that going with the flow is required. If you put that into the terms of the Western tradition, so far as Alfred North Whitehead has said the Western tradition is a footnote to Plato, then we could see that there's a tradition which always must separate reality from the agenda of human beings. So, and this seems to come to a point of the greatest sharpness. It said that in the essential time when Hazza supported the nation, there were if nation is allowed to be superimposed onto the situation of the Altai people or the Japanese, when samurai were a necessary part of life, a daily part of life, so that you had the linnet-like or small bird-like existence of the emperor, even at the end, the terminating point. I'm not sure if there were emperors following Hirohito. I thought that Hirohito was compelled to pay this penance or make this concession to the West after World War II of declaring the emperorship extinguished. But I'm not sure about that. But in any case, he was a very man of very small stature. But there's, if you look at 19th century photographs of Japanese samurai, you can see some very brutal and almost baboon-like in strength samurai, which stand in direct contradistinction to this class which ruled in tandem with the daimon, so that you had two capitals, one in Kyoto and one in what is now Tokyo, with a different species of beings, as it were, in one and in the other. This situation of the human being, which has come down to us as a historical accident, was at one time the center of a world, but we understand it now only at a distance. So is it that, to get to the main point of this post or dispatch, is it that Dasein must only begin with itself and then not quite understand the other Dasein? So, for instance, they give the most generic example, which is yet still a strong example, that's probably why it's a strong example, is the Westerner who was incredulous at a Japanese telling him that the same temple exists on this spot, when he knew at some place in let's say the Golden Pavilion, for instance. He knew this Golden Pavilion had been burned down and rebuilt, as featured in the Yukio Mishima novel. Because the idea of the same for the Japanese isn't the same as it is for the Westerner, because the Westerner is more focused on the physical building remaining intact, and then you have the problem of the ship of Theseus and so forth. But if you, in superimposing Western terms, understand it as the form, which is again a great interposition, a great imposition from the West, so that, in other words, like continuing on this theme that we're ourselves, and then we have to try to reach out to understand and explain to ourselves other times. This has been something which has come clear in literature and come clear in other forms, concomitant with the Enlightenment, I believe. This problem of history. So the problem of history. Can we, from where we are, do more than stretch out somehow towards other times and then imperfectly understand them? In Hegel, we had three different forms of understanding history. One, supposedly the naive form of history, which would be just to go from the understanding we have now to representing, quote unquote, representing things to ourselves as what representing means, for instance, in a written work, in Herodotus, the so-called father of history, when history was still historia, or investigation, direct investigation. But Hegel's point was perhaps peculiar to his own time, so-called time of the Enlightenment, so-called time of Prussia. Who can understand what that means except people who studied it and then study it as beginning from their own originary ground and then go to it, their own native ground, their own mother's milk, as Leo Strauss put it, what they've grown into. Supposedly, according to Hegel, Herodotus has put down something which now, from our perspective, not from Hegel's perspective, is like the immediate cultural common sense of a Greek of this period just prior to, or just at the beginning of the so-called Greek miracle. So there's Herodotus, and there's Socrates, and there's, before Socrates, there's Anaximander, and there's some kind of scene from the Horizon of Heidegger, a kind of event of a shimmering, being soaked in the light of understanding of certain notions which it's ineffable, it's unspeakable. How can we say something which had never been before. Certain questions raised by Anaximander, the arche, or which is to say, to distinguish between things that happened earlier. There's a grandfather, there's a son, etc. Things that happened earlier. The patriarch as the grandfather, as a great-great-grandfather. Instead, this notion of the arche as what sustains always and every time comes in. Or that's simply an example of an idea which at some time was perhaps a new idea at some time, but all ideas, all Seinverständnis, all understanding of being, presumably must in some, including the idea that all ideas have always existed, including the idea that there's something called eternity, including the idea that the concept of eternity is very questionable, that we can never demonstrate it to ourselves. So after David Hume, who happened to be Scottish, and Immanuel Kant, who regarded himself as having some Scottish ancestry, although he was up in the north of Germany and for a time under the control of the Königsberg, which was a time conquered by the Russians, regarded himself as having a ancestry which came out of the Scottish, which may have made him pay a special attention to Hume. Hume has given us this example of the questionability of the concept of his concept of causality, anyway, the Enlightenment concept of causality, which, if you look at the book by Lucien Fabre on the I forget how that's called. It's called something like Causality in the Time of Rabelais, or something like that, which has this thesis that before a certain date, the concept of causality was so unlike the concept given in the Enlightenment, given in Newton, let's say, maybe already in Galileo, which later on gets glossed as the instrumental causality and then linked to a part of the agential atia of Aristotle. But if you look at Aristotle, you get the impression that what we're calling the four causes, or the five causes, that agential and instrumental in one of them, appears to be the question of simply saying, not even why, which makes it more intelligible and more clear. Dale Strauss gives it as, says causality is a question of why, but it's more like you're according to the philologists in the earliest usage, it's more similar to the issue where somebody politely asks permission to make their leave. So they say, terribly sorry, King Charles, but I have other engagements, I must go, and would you give me leave to go? And somehow you're making this same, the original meaning of atia in Greek, which is translated or interpreted as cause, is one of the 4 or 5 causes of Aristotle, seems to have something like this situation of either begging leave, or polite request of some kind, and then we're left to try to explain to ourselves why we have gotten this situation which Heidegger has understood then as the situation where Plato is sort of the demiurge. He's all surrounded by the demiurge idea, which then kind of, in a way, punctuates in, Plotinus, but it's basically that Plato is the clockwork idea because his whole thinking centers around sort of a, how's it called? There's a certain kind of leather worker called a cobswain or something, conswain. The leather maker that maybe, well, let's just say a saddle maker. I'm not sure that's accurate, but there's somebody that Socrates used to hang around the edge of the agora because the youth weren't allowed to go into the agora because they had no proper business in the agora, but they used to hang around some leather maker's shop. And Socrates would accost them in dialogic provocations in that shop, and by a certain metaphor on what's necessary to make something. Through Plato, Aristotle comes to this notion of the four causes, so that one of the causes would be sort of like, what's the stuff? To use, again, it takes stuff, I think, already of a modern figure tied up with B.F. Skinner, which is Daniel Dennett, because Daniel Dennett likes to say one stuff, but he's stuck with this Geworfenheit that he's been kicked into, as it were. He's like the ingredient being thrown into the crucible out of the situation where the notion of substance, ousia, one stuff, is already there for him, and he's just arguing for one stuff, as against the view that is propounded by William James or so in around 1900, which then you see in its degenerate form in, I call it a degenerate form according to my predilections, let's say, in that guy that Jordan Peterson is always doing talks with Sam Harris, this kind of view that everything must be a matter of knowledge, and we can also regard, or everything must be a matter of knowledge or science, and we can also regard all inner experience as a matter of knowledge or science, including everything that you would get from someone like Terence McKenna, or in the gross example, I suppose the example that's more clear would be in the so-called William James' own work of the variety of religious experience, which isn't taken from the point of view of the traditions themselves, but is taken from outside, where everything is leveled to the question of how are these religious experiences to be understood by our mode of, in Heidegger's term, Seinverstandes, or being understanding, so that when I suppose you could make a sketch and say, even though there would be some pushback according to the general understanding of things at the time, if you try to understand it from Sam Harris's own point of view, from the time when he grew into the tradition, which would say the current view of science, the sciences, is reality, and it's the most authoritative thing in intellectual tradition. Not Buddhism, not the Confucian literati examination system, but science is supposed to be the most authoritative thing. And then we want scientific experts, and if there's a problem that the political branches don't trust those experts, that's something to be, it's a weeping matter, because of course we know that the sciences are superior, but it's just that for whatever reason they aren't, as Richard Dawkins said recently, they aren't fully respected sufficiently by the human, by the Dasein consciousness. But taken from that axis mundi, as it were, the youth of the Dasein of someone who is a follower of the most standard interpretation of the authoritative view, then you get this sort of normative notion circa a certain year, 1990, 1980, whenever it is, when Sam Harris comes to awareness of his view. Then you see that anyone that deviates in that time period from that norm, the weight of society, the authority of society will be displeased, as it were, and turn its face from that person. But taken from this, everything I'm just saying is a kind of superimposition on, say, the career of certain scientists of the view which comes out of the tradition of Hume, Kant, let's say Durkheim on the other side in the more tangible form. You have this Piaget, this so-called constructivist view, but basically the view that Alexander Dugin is attributing to the American anthropologists and to the what is this, anthropology and ethnology are the same thing, but ethnology sounds slightly scary, I guess. It sounds slightly like social Darwinianism to the American era, I think, whereas ethnology is, so far as I understand it, that's the word they use for anthropology in England. Maybe that's not true, because I don't think Alan McFarlane, my most favored living anthropologist, does use. I think that's a good question. I think Alan McFarlane calls himself an anthropologist, not an ethnologist. So ethnology sort of sounds racist or something, whereas anthropology doesn't, but maybe that's just to a certain ear. Then that again brings out this problem which Dugin has raised with regard to Heidegger. Is Heidegger a racist because he insists on the axis mundi, as it were, of himself or of the one carrying out the investigation? We have to start somewhere. We start from, according to Paul York, which is Heidegger's authority, that there's this phenomenon with generations. Generations have different understandings of things. You're a specific generation, I'm a specific generation. We have a specific understanding we've grown into. That's just one feature of being at the center of a kind of group. If you go by this Durkheim view, the first step to getting more freedom with regard to these kind of Kantian Humean questions of a priori rationalism versus full empiricism is to situate things in, say, we all have a kind of Dasein or group mentality. We all respond to the group to some extent. Then we can differentiate ourselves to a certain extent. With respect to all these difficulties, one must consider every action, say the action of the, this resigning of this prime minister. Why did this prime minister, in the end of October of 2022, which is right now, judged by the, as it were, the cultic culture, are etymons. They're related words, by the way. Judged by the cult of our, or by what is essential to our current thinking. We're in the end of October. We have a certain calendar that shows us what year we're in, etc., etc. These are all things that we've grown into as understanding, which then, in the full form of the Zeinfrage of the being question, are cast or thrown like an ingredient onto a crucible. Again, to use this metaphor of the alchemist. When Zizek comes out with his sort of not GeworfenHeidegger, but kind of GeworfenHeidegger, Heidegger as thrownness or castness as the transcendental. This raises many questions of some which can be treated with the exacting technical lancet, others which somehow require a eureka moment. In one of the recent, not recent actually, in one of the Alan McFarlane, his project of interviewing all the anthropologists, he interviews the anthropologist Roy Wagner, an American anthropologist with a German name, Roy Wagner, probably ethnically German by extraction, and very much in Jungian terms, sort of intuition type, who has no patience for rational thought. His view is he takes a subset of the side that they're of the constructionist view. He hates the constructionists, but it seems to be only because he's very almost. He hates Derrida. He hates people that are obscurantist, according to his way of thinking. According to my own view, which if it were in Nietzschean terms, it would have to be called a prejudice, but according to the way I see it, as something which stands above the two divergent avenues. He thinks that the constructionists and the Piaget people are too sort of cognitive about things. They're mulling things over, whereas the reality is. But he's written this book called The Invention. I think it's called The Invention of Culture, or The Invention of something or another. But his view is that things aren't constructed through reflection and so on, but everything is like a eureka moment. It's sudden. It befalls us. We solve the problem. We wiggle through it. We learn to. In Goethe's, I think Goethe's phrase is something like, "It's hard to swim before you know how." It's sort of like you're drowning, and then suddenly you find out a way not to sink. The dog paddle, whatever. You invent something. So his view is, it's just that he's still with these people that are not rational, not a prioris. he's still with these human people, but he just takes a different view about how it happens. He says, well, let's dial back for a second. So what is Hume? I used to call Hume a fictionalist. Some people call Hume a fictionalist. But this is the view. The other way to put that is Hume is an anti-rationalist, which is why I tried to communicate this idea somewhere in the discussion online recently as we could set Hegel as the ultimate rationalist, ultimate a priorist, who says we're controlled by this archetype. He doesn't actually use the word archetype, but it's basically we're guided towards rationality even though we don't know it, because there's the cunning of reason. Most people in their limited goals aren't seeking rationality, but they actually bring it about through the process of history and so on. But ultimately, there's this rationality that stands in what for Kant would have been the a priori position. What in common sense you could say would be innate or inborn or something. There's inborn dispositions, inborn inclinations, inborn predilections. The human race has an inborn tendency to develop something like a liberal. Okay, you can make all kinds of discussion about what Hegel thought there should be a constitutional monarchy, but the basic thing is that every human being will recognize through our inner nature that all human beings are equal under the law, and this formal equality rather than the three estates, rather than some other form of weighted votes, that the aristocrats get a bigger vote, or in this current Steven Pinker version, Steven Pinker as an expert with a lot of credentials gets a bigger vote than ordinary people, or that's actually an interesting point, is like the rights of man and the citizen, propounding the formal equality of all the citizens, says that the only condition for disparity of a distribution of the goods of the state to ordinary citizens is that they be doing is on the basis of talent. I'm not sure what they say talent, but basically the idea is like if somebody is doing a service to the state, say Putin, say the Russians think Putin is a capable man doing service to the Rus, to the state, to the Slavic people, to maintaining a certain world, then they won't say Putin is abusing this power by spending $1 billion on a palace somewhere overlooking the sea where he can look across and see Turkey across from it or something like that. But rather they'll say it's somehow befitting that the leader of a great people should have all this that the ordinary man doesn't have, precisely because he has to be because of the magnification of his importance on everyone, that everything should be as right as it can for that leader, something like that, or in a more modest form, just that Gorbachev should have a dacha or something. If that's the right pronunciation, a second house somewhere where he can go do his work, or he should have a secretary, or whereas the ordinary person shouldn't have a staff and a secretary, but that it serves some rational purpose. But then there's it strikes to me that there would be then a lot of difficulties in working out what is rationally deserved for anyone who is supposedly doing a service to the to the people, let's say, Norad or whatever. Or in ancient Greek circumstances, like they had something where people doing public service could eat in a certain building in Athens where they provide food gratis to the public servants, etc. But then who is allowed to go there? Is Socrates allowed to go there, or is Socrates an enemy of the people? Or would there be a negotiation about that? And the negotiation turns out to be the same negotiation as the negotiation about what is the logos, what is rationality, what is reason, what is of benefit to the people, etc. So all these problems are constantly, all these problems are in a concomitant storm, waiting upon even the most ordinary decisions, like I was trying to get to it. Why did this, how is her name, this prime minister in England recently, Liz Truss, or whatever her name is, why did she have to resign? What were her economic policies, and did they actually cause the upset, or was it that some people through irrational prejudice panicked because they didn't expect someone of her stamp to suddenly come in with her policies, or were the policies objectively bad? Was it just that she came upon unpredictable circumstances, etc., etc.? So to go back to this question of what is the Heidegger of Zizek within the GeworfenHeidegger notion, Zizek starts by asserting the notion of something along the lines of a transcendental analysis, as we find it in Kant, who took his bearings from Hume and from Rousseau. When he tries to impose that on Heidegger, which is, of course, would seem to be inadequate, but then one can say, what else can he do? Because if he's ignorant, he's ignorant. But then what does ignorance mean here? If we had somebody with a greater insight into Heidegger, they might be able to pose the question in Heidegger better, but if Heidegger himself has not seen the full truth, the truth of being, whoever sees Heidegger better would also not see that, and then maybe they themselves would have a scant on Heidegger. So we have very genuine, how do you say, radical, I can only fall back on Strauss's notion of the radical mystery of the dispensation of fate, but I want to try to militate against that by showing more exactly, with more exactitude,